First of all, religions tend to have a belief in a superior law above human wisdom or something similar. They have some laws that are even implemented in most countries today, like laws against stealing, murder, lying, at least in legal situations, etc. Most people probably also agree that these are things that should be forbidden. This is because even though stealing money from people can make you rich quickly, murdering is a sure way to get rid of people you don't like, and that through lying you can get special advantages and hide your mistakes and faults and make it easier to cover up bad things. For example, it causes a lot of problems for society as a whole and doesn't benefit the community. If people have to constantly watch their backs and their assets and what they own, they will have to spend most of their time doing that and won't be able to focus on their work. There would also be no point in listening to what other people say, or you would at least have to check everything yourself to make sure that it's correct and accurate. Just letting people do those things freely in a human society or community would make them more civilized life people have in certain parts of the world impossible. That's why having laws against these things is easy for us to accept, because even people without empathy or morals can, through logical reasoning, see the value in having rules and laws against these things. The problem comes with other things like forbidding people from practicing sexuality outside the sex in marriage between a man and a woman. People also have great issues with laws forcing people to believe in and worship mysterious beings they've never seen or met before, or maybe even a statue, while at the same time forbidding others from being worshipped or believed in. One may want to ask how things like these can make sense. So let's take a closer look at some of them. First of all, when it comes to the whole order and organization of sexual practices, as I've mentioned earlier in the video, the liberal mindset of as long as you don't hurt anyone, you can pretty much do whatever you want with who or whatever you want just doesn't work. At least they are sensible enough to be against pedophilia and sadistic sexual practices in many places, because people will otherwise do things like abuse and treat children and people poorly. But allowing everything else just because you feel like it's the right thing to do causes a lot of problems. So then, why are these things so problematic other than the dropping birth rate? I described earlier that if one just makes it obsolete through reproductive technology and a government program for raising children, it can be solved. Another thing about limiting sexual practices outside of a certain designated partner is that it limits the spread of infectious diseases, and especially sexual ones. It's especially ironic when certain of these come from other species, which kind of makes you wonder how they spread to humans. Anyway, it's almost like someone invented them to serve as God's judgment on people who sleep around with many things. I mean people. Ignoring my obvious dislike of people living their lives according to their sensual desires, it's also a way to limit people from experiences sexual abuse to a large degree as well. People sleeping around also tend to complicate many professional relationships, communication between people, and create conflicts. Although limiting sexual practices like one has done historically is the better choice in these cases on a societal scale, the best and most optimal solution is to completely replace sexual practices with reproductive technology. As for people's flaming sensual desires causing them to run rampant with their sexual practices, using artificial evolution to remove them from humanity in conjunction with an artificial and technological reproductive system is my recommendation. If all these things are done properly, all religious restrictions and rules on human sexual practices should become obsolete, and thus one wouldn't be dependent on religions to enforce them. The other thing I mentioned earlier was those rules regarding worship. Why do religions require people to devote themselves to their God and involve certain overly religious practices and things like that? Well, to begin with, this whole God thing is to have a being above people they have to listen to that one can use to threaten them with punishment. But what if they don't exist and they don't have the ability to punish them? Doesn't matter. What matters is that people believe they do. Having this and claiming that this super being has a law that people have to follow makes it so people think they have no choice but to listen to it. One may think that people could listen to it anyway, but we all know, or at least should know, that there's no way that would happen. The reason for that is that if a random person comes up with a new idea, people won't just start listening to it for no reason. Humans are creatures that generally don't like to do what someone else tells them to do by nature, but have a desire to rule or at least decide things for themselves. It's especially so if they believe that this law was made by someone who's either weaker than them or a smaller group of people than the community as a whole. Even if they do consider it but happen to not like some or any of them, they would most likely choose not to follow them anyway. And even if people agree with the rules, there will still be people who refuse to listen or oppose them just to not bow down to or listen to someone else. It's not just teenagers who have an innate rebelliousness. The trait also doesn't only come from people's desire to rule, but to not be vulnerable to being abused or taken advantage of by their leaders. There's also the part about not worshipping other beings or gods than the one or those of one's own religion. This part one think is mostly a form of self-preservation. It's also part of the reason for going so far as to worship the god of one's own religion. Just like any other organization, group, or company brand, it's not just about getting people to come to your religion, listening and remembering the message or getting what you offer. You have to keep them away from your competitors as well, which in this case are other gods and religions. Of course, one wouldn't have to be worried about an atheist doing that, but then again they are not the reason those rules were made in the first place. One also has to remember that back in the day it wasn't like in modern times where people depended on a good government to have a stable technologically advanced society and lifestyle. Historically, people would produce the things they needed themselves, at least until the last few hundred years or so. What this meant was that they needed another reason to band people together, and religion was a very effective tool for this. Due to people's need to band together to protect themselves from other hostile groups of humans and wild animals, they did this. It was during the time when humans didn't have the firepower, intelligence gathering or the technology to easily vanquish wildlife like we do today. It also brings me to another point. Religion and the belief in a mighty God protecting people has been a way to dispel fear from people and give them courage. One can see in religions described how they used it to instill fear in their enemies and animals as well, and endow them with an unnatural courage and bravery, able to completely bypass people's own protective instinct and fear of death and take on adversaries they would never dare to otherwise take on. Today other methods are used as well when it comes to making brave soldiers that are willing to put down their lives for their homes and countries, but at least historically this was a very effective way of doing it. After all, who wouldn't be fearless if you believe you will be protected by an almighty, all-powerful being to the point that nothing truly bad can happen to you? Regarding animals, one can see psychologically in them how they instinctively back down when facing humans or even other animals just because they display dominance and don't show any fear. Having this belief in a mighty being protecting people makes them more courageous by default. We have more things as well. There's also that thing about abuse and people taking advantage of others in the form of greed. That certain individuals exploit others to get an insane amount of wealth. Religions usually have a moral condemnation of this kind of behavior, but without it there's nothing really stopping it. Therefore, it requires a reprogramming of human behavior or some other method to get rid of it or oppose it, as people also have a tendency to be plagued by things like loneliness and helplessness. A religion also gives people a community where they're welcome and can turn to have company and help them. Not all religions, but it's a common theme in certain larger ones. What religion also leads to is that there is a natural law and order in society and that people feel morally obligated to follow them. People are also deterred from starting conflicts for no reason. Just like in society today with government bodies like the police and law and order, people have a wrong idea that it's mostly about giving people justice. That is, however, actually not true. Although they can and do at times provide that, the ultimate purpose of these things is not to make life fair or give justice. Rather it's about creating and maintaining order and preventing conflicts as well as rebellion. So by religions having these things, it also creates law and order and give people moral reasons to deter them from creating things like war or conflicts and encourages people to do what benefits the community. After all, if they're wronged, the higher-ups will carry out judgment and severely punish those people. This doesn't apply to all religions, of course. Some tend to be more violent than others. There are also those who have contributed to the spurring of people to help each other and cooperate. There are many international cooperations that are only possible by a foundation of morals that, although may not be that religious anymore, still originates from it. Another thing about religion today is that without a specific religion or system of beliefs governing a people, country or community, it makes it much more vulnerable to other influential groups or religions to come and take over, who many times do not come with good intentions. It's something that certain European countries have suffered greatly in recent decades when a certain religion that is opposed to their way of life has tried to take over their territories with a strong stream of immigration and caused a lot of chaos and disorder there. If one compares that to certain other countries, many of which have a strong religious stance, they didn't have that kind of issue at all. Religion has a unique ability to unite people and protect certain groups of people by preventing internal conflict and having a common goal. Often doing it by designating certain groups of people as bad or evil which one is supposed to oppose, while others as good which one ought to support. Only when two religious groups clash does it add fuel to the flame. Religions also teach that people should restrain their desires and not let them control their lives. We see what happens when people are allowed to do whatever they want, not mentioning any names here, but when certain political leaders, large business owners and even religious leaders, for example, treat the world as a chessboard, or should I say a strategy game, treating all their subjects as disposable pawns, just to get what they want, desire and crave, for example. It's one of the main reasons why the world is such a messed up place, and that's precisely why religions teach people to oppose their desires that supposedly don't serve the common good and have practices that also help do that as well. Of course, science could do a much better job with some artificial evolution in this area, but historically they couldn't do anything other than this.